All right, welcome to Virtual Face-to-Face with President Bruce Jarrell. I'm Alex Lukowski, Executive Director of Media Relations. Today, we have reached a turning point in our battle against COVID-19. Those were the words of President Joe Biden on Tuesday, right after the announcement that the CDC had approved the Pfizer-BioNTech pediatric COVID-19 vaccine for children ages 5 to 11. Now, that decision opened the door to some 28 million kids to get vaccinated right away. But before anybody gets too excited, the Kaiser Family Foundation released a survey about a week ago that shows a third of American parents plan to keep their kids unvaccinated. The greatest concerns, fear about potential long-term effects, particularly potential impact on future fertility. Now, that news is certainly the latest, but by no means is it the only vaccine-related news. The debate over booster shots continues to rage. In September, you'll remember the FDA, a panel put a stop to the Biden administration's plan to roll out booster shots to all vaccinated Americans, approving only the Pfizer booster 6 months after a second shot and only for adults 65 and older or those with a high risk of severe infection. A review of Israeli booster shot data published in The Lancet last week suggested booster shots are effective at reducing the risk of severe disease or death, but it doesn't answer the questions: is a booster needed? And is it the best use of vaccines or even ethical, since nearly half the world's population hasn't had shot number one? Another big vaccine question has to do with getting a booster shot of a vaccine different from the one the patient originally got, so-called mixing and matching. Our guest, Dr. Kirsten Leik, presented research results of a mix and match trial to the FDA in October. In the simplest terms, and she can give you the more detailed answers, her research showed that no matter what the combination, receiving a booster of a different type did raise the level of COVID antibodies and did not result in any significant side effects. The most notable improvement resulted in people who'd originally received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and were boosted with Moderna. That combination resulted in 76 times the level of antibodies. And Dr. Leik also noted in her presentation that the study looked at antibodies, not T cells. A further study into T cell response will likely shed more light on the impact of mix and match on the durability of immune response. Although overall new cases and deaths continue to decline in the U.S., there are hotspots. A surge in Colorado prompted Governor Jared Polis to allow hospitals there to turn away new admissions if they are at or close to capacity. In New York City, police and firefighters are resisting vaccine mandates. On Monday, 2,300 firefighters, in fact, called out sick in protest. The union chief says they aren't anti-vaccine, just anti-mandate. And even COVID variants are back in the news. British scientists identified a Delta Plus variant last month. Several U.S. states have already seen cases, including Maryland. The strain doesn't have its own Greek letter yet because it hasn't been formally identified as a variant of interest or concern, but eyes are peeled to see if it shows signs of being more virulent or easily transmissible. Now, even the good news that comes does raise some questions. In 3 weeks, believe it or not, the Macy's Thanksgiving Parade will be back in its usual form. But what's going to happen at the Thanksgiving dinner table? Last year was all about masking and distancing. It's a good bet family arguments this year will focus on who's vaccinated or boosted and who isn't, and whether the kids are going to get the shot. Now, joining Dr. Jarrell to talk about all that is, as I mentioned, Dr. Kirsten Leik. She's from the Center for Vaccine Development and Global Health at the School of Medicine. I want to remind the audience this program is being recorded, will be posted on the UMB homepage, umaryland.edu. A little later in the program, you'll have a chance to ask Dr. Leik your own questions. Please write them in the chat area. When it's your turn, we'll call on you by name, we'll unmute you. All you have to do is speak up. And if you want to remain anonymous, that's okay too. Just let me know that in your question. Now here's your host with all that out of the way, UMB President, Dr. Bruce Jarrell.
Thank you, Alex, and it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to welcome all of you in the audience and Dr. Leik, who we have the wonderful privilege at UMB of having such deep expertise at the Center for Vaccine Development on this burning topic of COVID. So I want to thank her for being on this discussion and enlightening us. I want to remind all of you that get your questions in early, because I have a feeling we're going to have extra questions today. So as soon as we start getting them, we'll get to them.
Video feed that went down. I don't know if you guys did it.
There we go.
That as well.
Now we got it. Okay.
There we go. And so we're probably all on the campus network, so it's possible that's a factor here. Anyway, it sounds like we're all back. Sorry for the audience.
All right, so Dr. Like, did you hear my question?
I did not. I lost the video feed.
Gotcha. Okay, so your general view of hotspots in the world and how places are doing and
Yeah.
sort of what's happening.
Yeah, so this week we crossed a few thresholds. One, in the United States, we crossed 750,000 deaths. It's almost an unimaginable number. 41,000 in the last 28 days. So if you think that COVID is ramped down, it is not. It is still out there. We also crossed 5 million deaths worldwide. And I think the current hotspot that has been getting some buzz is a fourth wave that's sweeping through Europe. And they're including Russia when they're discussing Europe. So Russia's having a huge wave that is going through the country right now. Predominantly, it's thought because of vaccine hesitancy. They have only about 30% of their population that's been vaccinated, and they have a very high degree of vaccine hesitancy, which probably relates to a lot of mistrust from the government.
Wow. Those are pretty awesome numbers still, aren't they?
Yeah, yeah. It's not gone away.
Not gone away. Okay, well, the sort of the main topic for today was the study that you just were involved with and sort of the ramifications. So could you tell people about your study,
Yeah.
how it was done, and a little bit about the findings that they may have read in the papers, but they may not have either.
Yeah. Yeah, we call it the mix and match. And we thought that we could anticipate that number one, we were going to need boosters. And number two, we really wanted to answer the question is to whether you could mix up the vaccines. What would happen? Could you accentuate your response and get a better response? Or did mixing different vaccines, maybe that would happen in the reverse where you would get an inferior or a worse response? And so we applied for and we got funding through the NIH at 10 different centers throughout the US. And I'm the protocol chair along with my colleague at Baylor College of Medicine. And we just examined that question. We took people who had had either the Janssen, the Moderna, or the Pfizer, and we gave them Janssen, Moderna, or Pfizer boosts. So right now we have 500 people across 9 different groups that we're following for a year to see, how they responded to the booster, what works the best, and to look at the immune response in a million different ways.
And so you recently reported out some of your results. So
Yeah.
can you give us some kind of sense of all of that?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of interesting that the timing, it really seemed to hit at the exact time that we needed to have some information about boosters, and coincided with the FDA meeting to decide how they were going to approve different boosters and who was going to be recommended to get a booster. So it segued really nicely, and we were invited to present our data. And the data that we presented was that in almost every circumstance, you could mix up the different platforms. In other words, if you got a Moderna, you could follow it with the Pfizer. If you got a Janssen, you could follow it with one of the mRNAs, either Moderna or Pfizer. And you could reasonably expect that you would get a really nice boost. But a lot of the take-home points have been comparing between groups. And that wasn't really the design of the study. We never intended to compare between groups. We didn't match people precisely between the groups. And so it's a little bit different to take home some conclusions as to reading between the lines between the groups. But the bottom line is that you can get really good immune responses no matter which way you go. But one startling finding was if you got a Janssen or the Johnson & Johnson, and then you followed it with an mRNA vaccine, that you could get 76 times the amount of antibody from your baseline response from before you got the booster. And that was very encouraging because people have been worried about the Johnson & Johnson and the longevity of that vaccine. And so based on those results, although we weren't intending for the FDA to change their booster conclusions, and I wouldn't have guessed that they would have since we weren't invited to, defend mix and match in any particular way. But I think that they thought that the results were so solid that the CDC actually went on to recommend that mix and match boosters could be done in people, and then gave precise populations and precise age groups that could get boosters.
So in the world of laboratory medicine, when you say a 76 times boost, in your mind, is that a giant boost?
Yeah.
It sounds giant.
It's a giant boost. Yeah, it's a really big boost. In fact, almost anyone that got one of the mRNAs had tremendous boosts, much higher than the highest level that was seen after their primary series. So the first vaccine series, whether you got Janssen or whether you got 2 doses of an mRNA, the findings after the boost were much higher than those original highest antibody results.
So what does that mean to you as a physician?
Well, there's a few caveats. That number one, we were only presenting data through the first couple of weeks after the boost, and we're going to be following those people for 12 months. So we'll have a lot of information, but we can only present the data in real time. So we still have quite a bit more of the study to go. Then the other take home is that there's a lot more to the story in terms of the immune response that you need to protect yourself. So there's protection against getting severe disease and death. And we know that all three of the vaccines that we have here in the US will do that. And then there's the immune response that protects you against symptomatic disease. And that's where the antibodies come in. So I know we're getting a little complicated here, but the bottom line is we don't fully understand all the immune response that's required to give you protection against severe disease and death, but all three of them do that very well.
That's very encouraging, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very encouraging. Now, as predicted, we're getting tons and tons of questions, and that's a good thing. So maybe the right way to go here, Alex, is to go to a couple of the questions and let's see how it goes. So why don't you pick out one or two here to start with?
Well, I don't like to pick favorites, but let me call on Corinne Borrell. Corinne, go ahead and ask your question.
Good afternoon, everyone. No, it's a privilege to, be in the inner loop here of what's going on. My parents were both researchers. I'm at the School of Nursing, just got my booster shot yesterday. So this is front and center for me since I work with a lot of people that refuse to wear masks and aren't getting vaccines and are coming in with 102-degree temperatures to the outpatient clinic. So this is quite personal as well as, but anyway, to get to the matter at hand, my question is, I had heard murmurings about a Delta booster vaccine. Is there indeed a vaccine being developed specifically for the Delta variant or variants, plural, number one? Number two, while of course the third booster, which I just had, the third shot, of course, ramps up your immune system, how effective is it at preventing symptomatic disease? We all know that these vaccines protect you from, severe illness and death, hospitalization. But of course, nobody really wants to get this disease, period. So what are any information so far about the currently offered vaccinations for protection against Delta, number one? Is there a vaccine being developed for Delta specifically, number two? And number three, are there other variants on the horizon that pharmaceutical companies are now trying to ramp up for? so far, and which regions are they coming out of?
Yeah, those are great questions. Thanks, Corinne. So number one, the short answer is yes. We are looking at vaccines that are targeting Delta. And counterintuitively, you might remember the South African strain that we don't talk about very much, but that one genetically is actually more distant. So we're also looking at that one, thinking that if you cover something that's much more different, you might encompass Delta as well. So we're looking at it in several different ways. And that is also part of our mix and match study. But the companies themselves are also looking at these questions in regards to Delta and other variants of concern. That's your first question. In regards, what do we know about boosters and symptomatic disease? And to some extent, so you'll probably see that we're not doing another trial with 40,000 people, right? And that's the kind of trial that you need to say, okay, does this booster provide protection? What we're doing is smaller trials, but we're looking at the immune response and the lessons that we learned from those earlier trials, and we're making sort of assumptions based on our immune responses. And our immune responses suggest very strongly that in almost all the groups, you're going to reach antibody levels, which should give you strong protection against symptomatic disease. But we don't know the longevity of that, and that's why we're following everyone for 12 months. And then your last question, I think, was whether there were variants of concern that were on the horizon. And this is a constant surveillance that's done around the world. And you might have heard that Delta Plus is out there. We think that's a sub-lineage. That means it's a sort of the evil grandchild of Delta. But the early thought process is that it's not going to rise to the point that it needs its own, Greek name. It's probably just going to be, Chucky 2 of Delta.
Might be the quote of the day.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay, Alex.
Well, it's only fair since we had a student. Why don't we hear from a faculty member? Rebecca Hall, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Awesome, thank you so much. And thank you especially for those of us at the School of Law who are not, don't have a clinical background for this. It's really informative. I also had two questions. So the first is really related to this study. Was there an indication that those who got an mRNA vaccine first, rather than the J&J, should swap to the other approved mRNA vaccine, go for the J&J? I'm not sure if there's a strong indication in that. And then the second one was just really quickly for those of us who don't have other eligibility criteria, such as being over 65. I just wondered if we should be seeking a booster, if we're close enough to quote unquote education that puts us into any buckets or anything like that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. So your first question, whether you can follow an mRNA with a different vaccine, and you can follow it. So if you got Moderna, you can follow it with the Pfizer. If you got Pfizer, you can follow it with Moderna. And if you got either of the mRNAs, you can follow it with the J&J. Perfectly safe, very good immune responses. We get into the weeds when we're sort of looking at, well, what is the best antibody response? And that's a very narrow window of the entire immune response. So I hesitate to say that one is better than the other because they're all giving tremendous antibody boosts, and they're probably all well over the level that you need for protection. Which gets to your second question, and that is, if you don't fall into one of the categories that the CDC has recommended that gets a booster, then you're not in the highest risk group that would be at risk. And of course, no one wants to get COVID. You don't want to expose yourself to long COVID. But right now, we're trying to thread the needle where we're advocating for boosters for people that are at higher risk so that we can also allow the companies to distribute primary vaccine product to the rest of the world. So, you know, that's a difficult needle to thread because there's a lot of ethical concerns whether we should be giving boosters in light of the fact that Africa only has a 3% vaccination rate. And I'm not an ethicist. I have some thoughts, but you know, these are complicated questions. So I would say that right now, you guys at the School of Law, by and large, unless you have some sort of immune compromised state, are doing fine and are protected against severe disease and death from your primary series. And whether we move in the future, like a flu vaccine, to a point where everyone gets boosters is something that we're taking month by month. So it's not you know, people get confused because the information changes, but it's changing because we're reassessing the data every single month in light of whatever the background milieu is and what we need to decide to keep everyone as safe as possible.
Great, thank you. Alex, keep going.
Well, in addition to questions about efficacy, we have a lot of questions that people have about the side effects. They're worried that, you know, if I had bad side effects from one, am I going to have even worse? Let me bring in Herbert Emmons. Herbert, are you there? Herbert. All right, well, I'm going to ask his question for him. He says, is it likely that one would decrease the severity one experienced with the first two Moderna injections by using the Pfizer booster? Would one decrease the effect of the booster by doing that, or present oneself with any undue health risk by mixing the two vaccines? So if I get, you know, health risk from one, then I'll get the health risks of the other.
Yeah.
And it doesn't...
Well, that's an interesting question, and we talked about that a lot. So number one, if you had, let me back up. First of all, the Moderna booster is half the dose of the primary series. In other words, it's 50 micrograms instead of 100. And the reason is because it gave very good immune response, but much less side effects. So there's that. The other question about mixing Pfizer with Moderna and what have you, we found in our study that the side effects were very similar to the primary vaccine. They weren't worse, but they certainly were still present. So if you got arm pain, you know, 80% of you are probably going to have arm pain. About half the people had some fatigue or felt some body aches. Those were very short-lived, usually less than 2 days. And I think that the side effects are worth it to get the benefit of protection. Are there long-term sequelae? Not that we see. Now, there are some interesting designer ways you could look at this. So in other words, if you're one of the people that had one of the rare myocarditis, that's an inflammation of the heart, the mix and match gives you an option where you could have a J&J and not put yourself at risk per se to getting myocarditis because you'd be avoiding that mRNA. Or if you're a young female and you're worried about the very rare risk of having blood clots to the J&J, you could follow up your J&J initial vaccine with an mRNA and avoid that risk. So there's lots of ways where this really opens up a lot of opportunity for people across the nation. You can walk into maybe a rural pharmacy and they're only stocking Pfizer and be comfortable that you'll get a really good immune response and not have to turn around and walk away and not get your booster. So I think it just adds flexibility without adding serious long-term outcome problems.
Alex?
Well, this may not be your area of expertise, but we have a lot of people asking, okay, we're talking about getting boosters and different boosters. where do I go to get a booster, and how do I say, no, I don't want that one, I want the other one? I mean, can you really do that? Can you walk into the pharmacy and say, no, I'll have the J&J, please?
So I can't speak to everywhere in Maryland or in terms of other states, but I know in the DC and the Maryland region, you can look up the mass distribution centers will say which vaccines they're distributing, and places like CVS, Walgreens, the pharmacies usually list what vaccine they're offering. And this is official CDC guidance that you can mix. So you can show up and bring your card and just say, I want this one, whatever your preference is. And if they're stocking it, there's no reason that they can't distribute it to you.
Great. We have a lot of questions that have to do with concerns about, as you would imagine, vaccines, and that's why people often are hesitant.
Yeah.
Someone writes anonymously, can Dr. Like speak to the rumor that COVID boosters induce labor in pregnant women?
Yeah, so there's been this whole, I don't know, sort of underground theorization of fertility, infertility, changes in menstruation. I haven't heard the labor arm of this, but it seems to be, a great concern to people. I can say definitively that there has been no science that proves any infertility related to the mRNA. And in fact, our trials, we told people not to get pregnant, and 40 people went ahead and got pregnant anyway. So that there's no evidence that it's causing infertility. Does it induce labor? That's a complicated question, and I don't know that I can answer. I can say, it does induce a pretty vigorous immune response. And if you're a woman that's, say, at 36 or 38 weeks, would that alone induce labor? I don't know, but conceivably they're close to delivery anyways. So you might imagine that could play a role, but I don't think it contributes in any way to early delivery or early onset labor. More often, and I'll say this from experience because I just got off the wards, pregnant women have a very low vaccination rate, let alone booster rate. It's somewhere around, 35% or something. And our wards in the MICU are filling up with pregnant women who did not get vaccinated and wind up on ventilators. It's happening today. There's people over there right now, and it's really remarkable because it's a unique population that we're taking care of in the intensive care units now. So the ACOG and all of the committees that oversee OBGYN strongly recommend getting vaccinated for pregnant women.
Is that data out on the street, Dr. Like? I mean, that seems like that's really powerful information.
About the fact that pregnant women are so susceptible.
And in the hospital and on ventilators and all
Well,
of that.
I mean, it's certainly well known amongst medical providers, but I don't know if that information is disseminating to providers that are taking care of women in maybe underserved or rural areas. I've had a lot of people say, well, my doctor told me not to get vaccinated, and that is absolutely not the recommendation that the advocacy groups for the OBGYN teams are recommending. They're absolutely recommending getting vaccination because you are not only susceptible because you didn't get vaccinated, but you're more susceptible as a pregnant woman to getting COVID and having more severe manifestations for a whole variety of reasons, which are complex to describe.
Thank you for that. Alex?
Well, another question that was bound to come up because we just had this approval of the Pfizer vaccine for kids 5 to 11. This anonymous member of the audience says asks, There has not been enough time to allow the study of long-term effects of the vaccines on children. How do we know the vaccines are safe in the long run? I've heard about concerns about the potential integration of the mRNA sequence into the human genome. What's your comment on this?
Yeah, that one I can definitively uh, uh, state that the mRNA cannot incorporate into your genome. It's by design a little bit of computer code which disintegrates within days of delivery. In other words, it just is a little bit of computer code that's encompassed in a little bit of fat, which we call nanolipids, just a complicated way of saying micro fat globules. It gets to the cell, the fat globules sort of unroof, the mRNA will then be read by your cell, but it never incorporates into the DNA. And in fact, just disintegrates and goes away. That's a natural part of the cell's response. Every day your cell is interpreting uncountable amounts of mRNA. So this has really no ability to incorporate into your genome. It's only telling your body to manufacture a particular protein, and that's the spike protein. And so there's no reason to expect that kids will have long-term sequelae, but you'll notice that it's November and that we're just getting authorization for children to get vaccinated. And that's because the FDA required the companies take a full year more to examine this in children, to get longer term data, and to iron out all those concerns, particularly about myocarditis, which is the heart inflammation. And in the Pfizer study, none of the 2,500 kids that were vaccinated got myocarditis. One of the reasons that Moderna hasn't been approved yet is that the FDA is watching them a little bit longer to make sure that it's safe in pediatric populations. So on one hand, people have been upset that vaccines for children haven't come out earlier, but the reason is to address your concern, to make sure that it's safe and that it's been followed for a longer period of time than was done for the adult population.
Someone points out here that the study group for the kids, for the 5 to 11, was less than a tenth of the original study group for the vaccine.
Right.
Does that
The
should we be
reason
concerned about
why
that?
is because we don't need 40,000 kids to say that it's efficacious at preventing COVID. So you do statistical analysis and you figure out how many kids do you need to reasonably pick up safety issues. And so the 2,500 or so kids that were studied were more for safety purposes, not to say this is a vaccine that works against COVID. So there are different questions that are being asked in the trials.
All right, let's bring in Susan Dorsey. She has a couple of questions. Susan, go ahead.
Yes, hi, thanks. Appreciate the time that you're giving us today to explain all of this. I just had a couple of quick questions. One would be, should you wait to get a booster if you're eligible until the variant-specific vaccines are available, or better to go ahead and boost now if eligible? And I guess this is an alternative to one of the other queries, which is, given the tremendous increase in antibody response following a booster with the mRNA vaccine, for those that didn't experience side effects or ill feelings after the first series, are they going to expect to feel poorly after the boost, given the dramatic increase?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we're not really sure that side effects correlate with the robust antibody response per se. So, taking your last question first, I don't think, if you didn't experience side effects the first time around, I don't know that we can say you will or won't have side effects the second time around. I can just tell you that 80% of people across the board had arm pain, 50% had feelings of, malaise or fatigue, 5 to 7% had a fever. So it's just the same numbers that we saw with the primary series we saw with the booster. So maybe you'll be lucky that, you know, if you didn't have symptoms the first time around, you might not have symptoms the third time around. But what we have noted is that as you get, like, the second vaccine has more side effects than the first, but then there's this long interval, and then you get a third dose or maybe a second dose if you had Janssen. And so it doesn't seem that there's more side effects than people had after the second one, if that makes sense. As to whether you should wait to get a vaccine that's targeting the variant of concern, I would say that it doesn't necessarily look like the companies are going to manufacture some of these variants yet. They're holding back because it looks like COVID kind of burns its way through populations in 2 to 3 months. So my recommendation is that if you do qualify for a booster, if you're vulnerable, you're a healthcare worker, or you're over 65, that you just go ahead and get the booster of your choice. That's, I think, the message that we want to convey, and protect yourself to the greatest degree that you can.
Great. Alex?
Question about your study. It's fascinating. Someone writes, that have there been other similar studies, and do they show the same kinds of things, or is yours the only study into the mix and match?
Yeah, there's two piles of data, put it that way. One, you'll remember that there was that fear of blood clots, and that was not only to the Janssen, which we have here in the United States, but the AstraZeneca, which is distributed around the world. And so many countries put a halt to people getting the AstraZeneca. And so there were many people that were caught midstream where they'd had one dose of AstraZeneca and then it went on study halt. And so a lot of countries, particularly Spain and Germany, looked at that very carefully, and they looked at what happens if someone got a follow-up, like a mRNA following, you know, a different type of vaccine, and reported that the immune responses were much stronger when you mixed up those platforms. And then on the back of that, our colleagues in Oxford in England put together a mix and match study, very similar to our study, which went into effect just shortly before ours went into effect. And so it's really nice because we have companion data that is done in a different country under different conditions, and then we can compare our results. So just last week, we had a World Health Organization booster symposium where we all presented our data to each other. And that's the other thing, that all this data is shared in real time. No one's, to my knowledge, no one, you know, at least in developed countries, are hiding data. We're all trying to get the best data out there to make real-time decisions. Hopefully that
Are there
answers
any
your question.
good data coming out of China?
Is there new data coming out of China? Well, I mean, I don't know that there's new data coming out of China. Obviously, there's a lot of accusations that they haven't always been forthright with some of the origins of the COVID, the strains. But it kind of leads me to another point, which doesn't necessarily address China, in that the World Health Organization actually has given their equivalent of EUA to 8 different vaccines, some of which are Chinese vaccines, and most recently an inactivated vaccine. So there are a lot of other vaccines out there that are being distributed around the world that we don't necessarily think about here in the United States.
Alex?
You may have heard this question. I have never heard this question. I haven't read about anything, but I'm going to bring in Manal Al-Suki to ask this question about mRNA and blood. Manal, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. So there are drugs that are mRNA medication, if you will, and usually those people who take the mRNA medications cannot donate their blood. Is it the same or similar to the COVID vaccines and mRNA that they have in them? And what's the difference?
So I'm not 100% sure we're talking about the same thing. Prior to the COVID vaccines, mRNA vaccines were in experimental studies predominantly for cancer patients. So you can say, oh, this protein is important for colon cancer, and you can make a vaccine that targets colon cancer, for instance. So that doesn't address blood donations, but I'm not aware of any previous barriers to giving blood after having received an mRNA product, which was only experimental and predominantly for cancer patients.
Great question. Seems like there ought to be a follow-up one day on that one.
Well, related to what you were talking about with Chinese vaccines, we have a lot of people at this university who are overseas, their families from overseas. Let's bring in Patricia Morgan, who has a question along those lines. Go ahead, Patricia. Patricia, you're unmuted. All you have to do is speak up.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, will you speak up a little bit? You're a little low.
I'm saying my daughter has been living in Thailand. She had 2 doses of Sinovac. She's coming back to the US next month. Should she get an mRNA? So should she get 1 dose or 2 doses?
Right,
So I think I heard you say that your daughter's coming back to the United States and had 2 doses of Sinovac.
Right.
And should they have an mRNA? And I don't know precisely. My hunch is that it would probably be fine, but where you fall into, a little bit of a gray area is, pharmacies like to follow rules. And they don't have any rules for people that got vaccinated with something that they aren't familiar with. So I don't know the hurdles that she might have in trying to get a booster of any form, when you've gotten not only a Chinese vaccine, but there's also the Sputnik vaccine in Russia and the AstraZeneca vaccine throughout Europe and in India. So these are kind of complicated questions which pop up, and I don't think the government or we have done a great job addressing them because they're anecdotal and it's a case by case kind of situation.
All right. These days, we're all thinking about the flu. It's flu season. And, when people get a cold these days, you think immediately, gosh, do I have COVID? I'm going to bring in Lisa Lewins, who wants to ask about the flu vaccine and what we should do about it. Lisa, are you there? Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Well, I guess you're going to have my voice. Actually, it's interesting I'm asking that because I just got a COVID test back. I'm sick right now. This is the first one.
Sorry.
This is kind of normal. But I normally get my flu shot as early as possible. And 3 times I've gotten a bad flu then in the month of May. So it seems to make sense for me maybe to wait a little on this. And since the current level of infection is somewhat low, would just love to hear about the efficacy and how long the booster has been lasting.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Yeah, so you're referring to pre-COVID when some of the circulating flu seemed to last much longer in the season. And so people maybe who got an October dosing might have had some waning antibody, 7 or 8 months later if you got a case of flu in May. What we're seeing so far is that flu has kicked in earlier, and I'm not a flu expert, so I don't want to wade too deep into this, but It's my feeling, and from what we've seen in our area, is that flu is a little bit earlier than we anticipated. So we have already seen circulating strains here in our area, and it's November, and that's much earlier than we typically see. And it may be, I'm just conjecturing, but remember, we almost had a non-existent flu season last year. So personally, I would say it's not the year to wait for your flu vaccine. I think if you have the opportunity to get it, you should probably go ahead and get it now.
Alex?
An anonymous audience member asks, how do we know if vaccines are safe for children with disabilities, such as kids with Down syndrome or brain seizure disorders? Did the study populations including any children with disabilities?
Yeah, these are really hard questions. I think it has to, number one, it's very hard to get large numbers of any particular disability or what have you. The NIH does have studies that are going on with two categories. One, transplant, and two, people that have some sort of autoimmune disorder and need to be on medication like a biologic. And they are struggling to figure out how best to dose those people or those kids. That doesn't address, say, children with Down syndrome or some other disability. And I don't want to paint everything with a wide swath because there's always exceptions, but I think the exception would be rather extraordinary. There's no reason that I can envision why someone with Down syndrome, or for that reason, any sort of genetic disability would have a problem with a COVID vaccine, because mRNA just simply doesn't go into your genome.
Since you brought that up, could you, for the audience, just talk about what trials do you have coming up in COVID, but in other things like influenza, where you need particular populations? And what kind of appeal would we make to the listeners to say, we really need people in this category for vaccination trials?
Well, NIH right now is doing trials with the two that I said, the people with transplant and people with autoimmune disorders, and they're recruiting actively now. At our center, we're still doing the mix and match. We're up to 14 different groups, and we're adding as we move forward. We're in a pause right now because we're just getting all this data organized and trying to release it. We always have flu studies ongoing here at the Center for Vaccine Development. And there are many companies who are looking at combining an mRNA flu with an mRNA COVID and kind of looking at getting vaccinated concomitantly, not here at our center, but in other studies. So you can always go to clinicaltrials.gov to find out what's in the greater Baltimore, Washington area, or you can go to the cvdtrials.org where all of the studies that we're doing are usually listed.
What groups do you have the hardest in terms of accruing subjects in a certain category?
I mean, the COVID has been really actually fairly easy to recruit for because people are so invested in that. So we haven't had very much trouble recruiting for COVID. A lot of the pediatric trials were done here, and I'm not a pediatrician, but similar to our adult studies, there was an overwhelming response by people who wanted to participate. And so it turned out that there were a lot of people who just didn't get in line early enough and weren't able to participate. So we never want to cause hard feelings. It's not, there's nothing personal about who we choose, but we try to do our best. So right now, we don't have any difficulty recruiting for the COVID vaccines, but that doesn't mean we're not going to have new trials coming up or new trials going up that are recruiting. We try to, do a media blitz and a advertising campaign when we are doing new trials.
Great. Alex?
The guidance for booster shots is a little vague, maybe intentionally vague, in that, people are advised, 65 or older, that's clear. But if you have some condition that you think may make you more susceptible, is that a way of saying, go ahead and do it? Or is it a way of saying, actually, you should have a serious condition if you're younger before you do it? What's going on here?
I think that there's so many permutations of what might be a vulnerable person that it's almost impossible for the CDC to issue guidance that is comprehensive and covers every situation. So if you have questions, talking to your medical physician is probably the right way to go. It's usually fairly obvious, or they'll put out very specific exceptions like healthcare workers or people who are in the front lines. And so the CDC is always a good site to go to for any specific guidance. And beyond that, you can talk to your personal physician to kind of drill down on someone who knows you.
Someone points out that obesity is listed as a concern. That's a huge percentage of Americans, and
Yeah.
there's obesity and there's obesity. There are people
Yeah.
who, how concerned should people be if they are overweight, or if maybe they're technically obese, but in the scheme of things they're not morbidly obese?
Yeah, I mean,
what should we read into that?
there's different thresholds of what we term obese, and that it has been associated with elevated susceptibility to COVID, in addition to other, illnesses like hypertension, for instance. So, I think that because there is so much gray area, at least from what I've heard, if people consider themselves at risk, they've fairly easily been able to get a booster when they go to an outside pharmacy. I'm not saying that that's the right or wrong thing to do. And again, I'd have to kind of defer people and ask them to talk to their individual physician, because there's so many, variables that could play into whether you're at risk or not.
Sure. This wasn't in your research, but it's similar sort of thought. Someone's asking, what does the research show about getting the vax or booster after recovering from COVID? Because some people think, well, I've had COVID, so I'm good.
Yeah, well, there's actually really good data that shows this is a little bit different scenario. Let's just say that you didn't get vaccinated and you got COVID. There are a lot of people who say, well, getting COVID, my immunity will be better than getting the vaccine. And that is simply not true. The vaccine will give you much more predictable and stable immune response. What we can say is that if you got COVID and then you got vaccinated, your response is even better than people who got the primary vaccination series and never had COVID, which is not to say go ahead and get yourself exposed to COVID so you can get a better response. The point is, if you've had COVID, you will do better by getting a vaccine. Now, if you got your primary series and then you're wondering whether to get a booster, and then you end up getting COVID, this is getting into areas that haven't really specifically been studied, but the CDC will say, wait till you're asymptomatic for 10 days before you go ahead and get that booster. And the World Health Organization will say, wait for 12 weeks before you go ahead and get that booster. So there is some difference of opinion, depending on where you are in the world. But everyone agrees, at least for the primary series, that you should go ahead and get a vaccine series.
Alex, we got 4 minutes
Well,
left.
okay, well, everyone wants you to give specificity that you can't always give, and I know that's
That's
a real. But I'm still going to bring in JA. JA has a question about looking at vaccine efficacy. JA, are you there? We're having trouble today. JA?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Oh, there you go. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your time today. I just wanted to ask where we can find information on the exact efficacy rate of each of the vaccines. So if I got the Moderna in my second dose in April, where does that stand today? And that would be the same question for each of the vaccines.
Okay, so that's a little bit different in terms of we can say, you know, what the average immune response would be, say, I don't know, 7 months after your vaccination in April. But those would be kind of buried in the papers. It doesn't really give you efficacy results because that's not really something we're able to follow very well when we're looking at smaller groups of people. But we can look at the immune response and we can see what happens, you know, whether you got Janssen or Moderna or Pfizer. We can say, okay, at 7 months, this is where, you know, the group lies. There's going to be a spread and no one's going to be able to tell you if you're on the lower or the higher end, but you can kind of get a sense of the average of where people are. But we know, and that's why the FDA, you know, did approve boosters, is that there does seem to be a fall off with the Pfizer at about 6 months, and Moderna might be a little bit later, maybe 8 months. But in that general range, we do see that people start to have more, you know, quote unquote breakthrough infections.
Alex, one
Yeah.
more.
One last quirky question. Someone asks about shingles, that she's heard that some people have gotten a booster shot and then their shingles reoccurred.
Yeah,
Is there
that's
something to
interesting.
that, or-
There was a higher than expected incidence of people getting zoster or shingles once they had gotten one of these vaccines. And that's a phenomenon with vaccines in general.
Oh.
It may be that just sort of your immune response is sort of being boosted up. And for whatever reason, you know, the shingles virus is an opportunistic type of virus where it likes to take advantage of times where you're tired or stressed, or maybe your immune response is boosted from some other illness or a vaccine, and it likes to pop out during that time. And that may be what we're seeing.
And that's a tough one to get, that's for sure. So, Alex, unless you've got something burning a hole in your, no? No. Well, first of all, Dr. Like, thank you for this. This was a wonderful discussion.
Thanks,
and,
Dr. Jarrell, for inviting me.
I really have enjoyed what you've had to say. It raises, of course, lots of other questions which I would love to ask, but not today. I was just thinking as we were having this discussion, did we ever have such a discussion about this, about the flu vaccine or smallpox or polio? Never. And the world is so different. Here we are, a group of people having a discussion about sort of esoteric medicine from a certain point of view.
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating to step back and look at that. But I really appreciate what you've had to offer here. I certainly want to compliment you for this important study and for all that CVD has been doing. So thank you very much. It's been wonderful having you here. And perhaps again sometime we'll get you back.
Thank you so much. It was really
Okay.
fun. And thank you for your great questions. It always keeps me on my toes.
So thank you for the audience, and we'll be around in the next couple of weeks for another one of these. So until then, see you.